I want to tell you about the first boat I ever tried to make watertight, because I got it completely wrong, and the way I got it wrong ended up teaching me more than any book on my shelf ever did. I had built myself a little clinker rowing skiff, and clinker just means the planks overlap one another like the shingles on a roof, each board lapping over the one below it. I was proud of that skiff. Then I sealed every seam tight with a modern compound after the whole hull was already together, the way I had always been shown to do it. 2 seasons later, she wept water from a dozen places at once, and for the life of me, I could not understand why. What nobody had ever told me, and what I would only learn years later from a white-haired shipwright in an Essex boatyard, was that the Norse had solved this exact problem more than 1,000 years ago. And they solved it by doing the one thing I never once thought to do. They sealed the boat as they built it, not after, during. If you had walked into a modern boat shop and told the builders you were going to stuff a hull seam with sheep's wool and moss, most of them would have smiled politely and gone back to their work. It sounds primitive. It sounds like something you do when you cannot afford anything better. But the men who built the longships were not doing it because they were poor. They were doing it because it worked, and it worked for a reason that took me half my working life to understand. The old shipwright in Essex, a man who had been building and mending wooden boats since before I was born, said something to me that I have never forgotten. He ran his thumb along a plank lap and told me that a good seal does not fight the wood. It moves with it. He said the joint we were looking at would hold longer than you and me both, and I believe he was right. That one sentence undid everything I thought I knew about keeping water out of a boat. So today I want to walk you through the whole method, step by step, the way it was actually done. We are going to cover how the seam is sealed during the build, what goes into it and why, how a hull that twists and breathes stays tight anyway, and how the whole thing gets dressed and then kept alive for decades. By the end, you will understand not just what the Vikings did, but why it lasted, and how to borrow that same thinking for anything you build that has to live outdoors. Let me start with the problem, because until you feel the problem the way I felt it, the solution just sounds like folklore. A wooden hull wants to leak. That is its natural state. Wood is a living material even after the tree is felled, and it never truly stops moving. It is hygroscopic, which is a fine old word that simply means it drinks moisture from the air and the water around it, swelling when it is wet and shrinking back when it dries. So the seam between 2 planks is never a fixed gap. It opens a little, it closes a little, it works back and forth every single day the boat is in service. Now think about what I did to my poor skiff. I waited until the hull was finished, rigid and whole, and then I forced a hard sealant into seams that were never going to stop moving. The first time that hull flexed in a chop, my beautiful rigid seal cracked, and water found the crack. That is not bad luck. That is physics doing exactly what physics does. The Norse builders understood this in their hands, even if they never wrote a word of it down, and their answer was looting. Looting is the heart of the whole thing, so let me define it plainly. Looting means bedding a soft, tarred packing material into the seam as the plank goes on, so the seal is built right into the joint from the very first moment. Picture the builder laying down a plank. Before he sets the next plank over it, he takes a rope of tarred wool, sometimes mixed with animal hair, sometimes with moss gathered from the bog, and he lays it along the land, which is the overlapping face, where one plank will sit on top of another. Then, he lowers the next plank down onto that soft, tarry rope and fastens it home with iron rivets. As the rivet draws the 2 planks tight, the wool squashes and spreads and fills every hollow in the wood. The seal is not sitting on top of the joint. It is inside the joint, pressed between the 2 faces, held there under gentle, permanent pressure. I want you to picture the feel of it, because the doing is where the understanding lives. The wool is cold and tacky in your hands, heavy with tar, and it smells of pine and pitch and the fire it was warmed over. You lay your rope of it along the land in one steady line, not too thick, not too thin, and you set the plank down over it with care. Then the rivet goes through, and as you draw it home, you can watch the tarred wool bulge and press out along the edge of the seam, squeezing itself into every dip and rise in the grain, until there is no gap left for water to find. You are not filling a hole. You are building the seal and the boat in the very same motion, and the 2 become one thing. That is the difference that changes everything. My modern compound was a patch laid over a wound. Their looting was a gasket built into the bone. When their hull flexed, the wool flexed with it, springing back, staying packed, never cracking, because it was never hard in the first place. That is your seal. That is the secret the whole video is built around, and honestly, if you take nothing else from me today, take that one idea and let the rest be detail. Now, before we go deeper into the materials, I want to pause and tell you where the rest of this method lives, because I have spent years pulling it together in one place. Everything I am teaching you today lives in fuller form in my book, Secrets of the Shipyard, 150 pages across 16 chapters. Inside, you will find watertight faying without a drop of glue, wooden tree nails that tighten with age rather than loosen, and 3 full build projects worked start to finish. If this speaks to you, scan the QR code on screen and it is yours. So we have the seam sealed and pressed tight. But what happens next is where most people, myself included, lose the boat entirely, because the material you pack into that seam matters just as much as the timing. Let me talk about the wool, because the wool is doing something clever that took me a long time to respect. Sheep's wool is springy. It has a natural crimp to it, a kink in every fiber, and when you compress it and then release it, it wants to push back. Soak that wool in pine tar and you have a packing that is both waterproof and elastic at the same time. The tar keeps the water out. The wool keeps the seal moving. Together they make something that a hard sealant simply cannot be, a barrier that bends. Animal hair does much the same job, and in many yards the two were mixed, because hair adds a coarser, tougher fiber that grips the wood and resists being squeezed out of the seam over the years. And then there is moss, which people always find surprising. In parts of Scandinavia, the builders pack the seams with bog moss, and there is good reason for it. Moss is fibrous, it holds tar well, and when it is compressed into a joint, it forms a dense, springy gasket that seats itself into every irregularity in the timber. A gasket, if that word is new to you, is simply a soft packing, squeezed between two surfaces to stop anything passing through the join. Your car engine is full of them. So was every good longship, only theirs were made of the bog and the back of a sheep. There is a quiet genius in that, using what the land freely gave, and having it outperform things we would consider far more advanced. You would think somebody would have kept doing it exactly this way forever. Most did not, and I will come back to why, because the reason is part of the lesson. Now let me show you why the clinker hull itself is built for this kind of seal, because the seal and the structure are two halves of one idea. Remember, clinker means the planks overlap, and each overlap creates a long, faying surface running the length of the boat. Faying surfaces are simply the two mating faces where one piece of wood beds against another, and in a clinker hull those faces are broad and generous, which gives the luting plenty of room to sit and plenty of surface to grip. A clinker hull is also, by its nature, a little bit flexible. It gives. It works in a seaway, twisting and springing as the waves pass under it, and an old shipwright will tell you that this flex is not a weakness at all. A hull that gives a little sheds the load instead of fighting it. But here's the thing that ties it all together. A hull that flexes needs a seal that flexes, or the two are at war. Put a rigid seal into a flexing hull, and the hull will win every time, cracking your seal open on the first hard day at sea. Put an elastic seal into a flexing hull, and they move as one body. The wool breathes when the wood breathes. The seam opens a hair. The tarred packing expands to fill it. The seam closes again, and the packing simply settles back. Nothing ever cracks because nothing was ever brittle. The Vikings did not just seal a boat. They matched the seal to the way the boat lived. I learned that the hard way, and I want you to learn it the easy way, from an old man telling you plainly. My rigid compound was not a bad product. It was a good product, asked to do a job it was never built for. I had taken something meant to hold still and put it inside something that would never hold still for a single hour of its life. The wood was always going to move, because that is what wood does, and the moment you accept that instead of fighting it, the whole method stops sounding like folklore and starts sounding like plain good sense. The Norse builder did not have a better sealant than me. He had a better understanding of the wood, and that is worth more than any bucket of modern compound ever made. Once the whole hull was planked and luted, there was one more step, and this one dressed the entire boat like a coat of armor against the water. They paid the hull. To pay a seam, in the old shipwright's tongue, means to dress it over with a waterproofing coat, and what they used was pine tar, sometimes worked warm so it soaked deep into the grain. They brushed and worked that tar over the whole outside of the hull, into every seam, over every plank, until the timber wore a dark, water-shedding skin. The tar did two jobs at once. It sealed the outer face of every seam from the weather, and it soaked into the wood fibers themselves, slowing the rot that claims every untreated boat in the end. Now, this is worth sitting with for a second, because it is the exact opposite of the method that replaced it. In the later Carvel style of building, where the planks sit edge to edge with smooth sides instead of overlapping, the seams are sealed after the fact by hammering oakum into them. Oakum is tarred hemp fiber, picked apart by hand from old rope, and it is driven hard into the seam with an iron and a mallet once the hull is already built. It is a fine method, and it built the great ships of the age of sail. But notice the difference. Carvel caulks the seam afterward from the outside, under force. The Norse luted the seam beforehand, from within, under gentle and permanent pressure. Both keep water out. Only one is built to move with the wood from the very first day. There was a small detail in how the Norse did it that seemed minor to me at first. It was not. They did not seal once and walk away, because here is the part that actually bought them the centuries. A luted, tarred hull was not sealed one time and forgotten. It was fed. Every season, or every few seasons, the boat was hauled out, cleaned down, and given fresh tar, worked back into the seams and over the planks. The seal was treated as a living thing that needed tending, not a finished job that would look after itself. And that changes the whole way you think about keeping water out. A modern sealant is sold to you on the promise that you do it once and never think about it again. And that promise is exactly why it fails, because nothing outdoors lasts forever without care. The old builders never believed that promise. They knew the tar would weather and thin, so they simply renewed it, and a hull that was faithfully retarred could serve honestly for decades. Trust the wood and tend it, and it will carry you a very long way. So, let me pull all of this together into something you can actually take to your own bench, because you do not need to build a longship to use any of it. The lesson underneath the whole method is one simple principle. A seal that moves with the wood lasts. A seal that fights the wood fails. Once you truly believe that, you start to see the mistake everywhere. The cracked line of sealant around an outdoor window frame. The split caulk on a garden bench that lives in the weather. The planter box that rotted from the inside because someone trapped the water in with a rigid coating instead of letting the wood breathe and shedding the water off the outside. Every one of those is my old skiff all over again, a hard patch, losing a slow argument with a living material. So when you build something that has to live outdoors, think like a Norse builder, where you can bed your seal into the joint as you assemble it, not after. Choose materials that stay flexible rather than setting bone hard. Favor a finish that soaks into the wood and sheds water off the surface, like a good oil or a traditional tar or pitch, over a film that will crack the first time the timber moves, and accept, gladly, that the finish is not forever. Renew it. Feed it. A thing you tend will outlast a thing you seal once and abandon every single time. That is not a trick. That is a whole way of respecting the material in your hands. The men who built those ships are long gone, and most of their names were never written down. But the boats they built carried people across open ocean and came home again, season after season, for longer than most of us can imagine. What endures from them is not a single clever gimmick. It is a way of thinking about wood as a partner instead of an opponent, and that way of thinking is yours to inherit the moment you decide to build like it will outlast you. That is the real inheritance. Build for the century, not the season. If this has stirred something in you, the full craft is waiting in Secrets of the Shipyard, my 150-page guide to the old preservation methods, with 3 build projects made to outlast you without glue or screws. You will find it through the link in the description. For more of this ocean-tested woodworking, built to stand for centuries, subscribe to the Master Shipwright.